Okay. Good afternoon, ladies and gentlemen. So, just tired. Attention, please. Yes, we now begin class. And I prepared the printouts to cover this class discussion. They're placed at the front desk. Move forward to pick up one of them. Hand it over to Steve. Okay, you see in the projection titled the documentary transaction. This point is critical to distinguish between domestic and international contract, as I've introduced in the early class. So what is a document transaction? Sales contract, as a matter of definition, is to deliver the good in exchange for the payment of contract amount. That is also essential, reserved in essence about international contracts. However, the practical aspect is very distinguishable, as you see in bill of lading or a bill of exchange draft, a side draft, time draft, many documents exchange. And an intermediate party would involve a commercial bank for the buyer, or in conform letter of credit. In the context of conform letter of credit, the seller's bank also is involved to provide a weighty guarantee against the risk of payment. So the international trade is a destiny. Particularly if you see the ocean transportation, ocean carriage. Most of transaction would involve an ocean carriage. We later explore trade terms encoded by International Chamber of Commerce, and there are some groups that could not be applied to the shipment context of transaction. Ocean carriage would not be available in some area of trade terms, but vastly ocean carriage would involve in transaction. And also one other point is that the risk of payment. The seller, or in most probability, fear of about non-payment, since they are new faces and placed in geographically distant locations, other countries. So various factors about the attribute of international trade, quality of international trade, would urge some of different concepts about the sales contract. As you see in bills of lading, you may learn its characteristics in terms of a legal quality. So you will see it represents the legal title of the goods. So see that the buyer, the interest in primacy would rather look to the bills of lading other than goods. So they like to receive a conforming bill of lading. Of course, there are types of bill of lading or received bill of lading, received shipped bill of lading, and onboard bill of lading, and other scope of differences you will be presented in later of this class. Also, there are controversies involving the provisions of UCC and Incoterms. So, what is a varied onboard value, unless otherwise specifically agreed by the party? Can we accept the received bill of lading other than onboard or bill of lading? The issues could develop in some of a comparative viewpoint that the traders and also legal counsel should have awareness. In recent trend, we also witnessed some of evolution in terms of a exchange of a document, electronic bill of lading or electronic data interchange, what we call EDI. So we'll later see the brief context developed in this area. For example, Bolero, Bolero and Paxson, both institutions now praying to correspond with the development of a charting recently about EDI. The Society for Worldwide Interbank Financial Telecommunication and through Transport Crowd. The Bolero was developed in the midst. It is designed to be utilized by all parties in the trade process, including importers, exporters, freight forwarders, port authorities, inspecting agencies, carriers, customs, exigencies, customs agencies, and financial institutions. So, you have some distinct dealings which would not be encountered usually in domestic commercial law or particularly in civil law of contract. We often learn some of theories and tenets upheld through tradition and laws, freedom of contract, and a scope of a statutory forms of contract. 14 contract, or as you see in the Civil Code of Korea, would be presented to you for review and subject to the party autonomy and also a trade customs. But the discourse of international contract would be notorious about this kind of concern and the ways of approach. One other approach would be centered on CSG, which often employ the familiar term included in a contract class of this law school. So you need to see both a practical aspect, both practical and aspect of legal significance. So it follows that practical differences in dealings would also be structured into some of a legal regime. You see, what is the essence as coupled between 2 points? The transportation of goods would be converted into sales of goods would be converted into concept of sales of document. So the point is received more easily if you suppose, as I've introduced, the bill of lading is a legal title document in replacement of actual goods. So in legal theory, it substitutes the law, national laws also, what is the, particularly you have that consequence, that the controversy about the ownership of goods would be resolved in favor of possession of documentation rather than actual possession of goods. That is the point, you see. The sales contract could be shared, in essence, at the point where the payment and delivery of goods were exchanged. In documented transaction, the concept would differ, not differ fundamentally, but in many ways of construction to be converted into a sales of a document. That, as I've said, that does not undermine the aspect involved in the international sales contract, essential, preserved with the delivery of goods and a payment. So both ways to approach would survive. In some cases, the claimant may argue on a bills of lading theory, and in some cases they may recourse the underlying contract involving sales of goods and payment. And also a plethora of institutions employed to support the tricky aspect of international contract. For example, insurance policy would be difficult. So many points to establish cause of action could be explored. In the case the contract would eventually fail or non-conforming goods would tend the kind of misfortune that the traders do not often like to see. So in Exhibit 9.1, entitled Method of Payment Risk Sale, you can see some articulation in clarity and large font, methods of payment risk scale. So for the exporter, the lowest risk would be cash in advance transaction. And it is most pre-model context of transaction. We tender cash in exchange of goods. And for the highest risk, exporter may, in some cases, utilize an open account. That would be beneficial in terms of risk assessment for importer, quite opposite to the exporter interest. An open account would be unusual in statistics. They could be utilized in limited circumstances. For example, the parent and subsidiary company may use this way of a payment method to practice their transaction, and also some establish the credit for the buyer would enable the use of this payment method. In the median, you can see the two types of legal institution, documentary collections and letters of credit, which would be prevailing to govern most of a commercial transactions in the international market. You have been presented two sets, and should note some of differences, which is very fundamental in terms of insurance about non-payment. Letters of credit is the greater way to finance the sales transaction, and often credible commercial bank involved, and the responsibility to issue letter of credit would be set forth when the contract agreement was entered by both parties. So the buyer in this arrangement is required to arrange his bank, his local bank, to issue letters of credit on behalf of a seller. And a distinct area of rules would be developed to ensure the high risk of a non-payment. For example, independent principle is operating to separate the claims or defenses arising from underlying transaction. Autonomous principle would exactly come in that consideration. So in this arrangement, the buyer, the seller, would be more relaxed from any fear from arising from non-payment possibilities. In tabulated a structure of international transaction. Both methods come into similar quality. However, as I've said, the independent principle offers the basis to this both sphere. Document collections would not be afforded in the institution of letter of credit, and in this case, the drafts or a bill of exchange is the principal way it's claimed. So the contention or controversy in case of dispute will be resolved by ways of other legal principles. The pertinent to bills, drafts, or bills of exchange. Both would share the context. The letter of credit relationship would allow more clarified way for the buyer from many distinct rules afforded for the institution. And in document collections, we see two types, which varies to serve the buyer's interest. Documents payment against payment, and other is documents against acceptance. So documents, in the case of documents against acceptance, the time draft would often be issued to claim the contract money. And documents against payment would enable more ready resolution about the payment problem. So the seller would prefer this method, documents against payment. There will be different in power in documents against acceptance. So time draft is rather unusual, which could be employed in case they have a close and a credible relationship over the record of a business interchange between the parties. And in letters of credit, I have said that two types would be available. Normally, it is non-conformed, but however, the seller may wish to double guarantee from both banks. His bank, his local bank, and also the buyer's bank. In that case, confirmation would be attached, and the conforming bank has same responsibility about the payment matter. So it is more or safe way to deal. However, the independence principle do not in all cases oblige the commercial bank to pay on behalf of buyer. They have the right to inspect the documentation, whether it is a proper and conforming to the requirement contract, what is. Also, however, the scope of review should be limited, since the independence principle operates to sever from the claims or differences arising from underlying transaction. So you may have awareness briefly about distinct aspects of international contract law. So we need to consider the seller's payment risk and the buyer's delivery risk. The seller fears relinquishing control over its goods before receiving payment, and the buyer fears making payment before obtaining possession of the goods. So the method of payment agreed to by the parties determines who will bear the burden of these two risks. Sales within the United States, if the buyer has good credit, sales are usually made on open account. If not, cash in advance is required. So in domestic context, open account also is a popular way, as in Korea and United States. For products sold abroad, there are several basic methods of payment. As with domestic sales, a major factor that determines the method of payment is the seller's level of trust, the buyer's ability and willingness to pay. So I introduced about several ways of a payment method in international contract: open account, consignment sales, documentary collections, documentary credit, and cash in advance. And we have finally considered a consignment sale. This is another immediate method of payment. In international consignment sales, the buyer receives use of goods. The title remains with the seller until the goods are sold to a third party. This method is the most common when goods are shipped to a foreign distributor to be sold on behalf of the exporter. The exporter retains title to the goods until the distributor sells them. Once the goods are sold, payment is sent to the exporter. With this method, the exporter accepts a great deal of risk and loss of control of the goods and may have to wait an extended period of time for payment. When this type of sale is contemplated, it may be wise to consider some form of risk insurance. This arrangement would be typical to establish some commercial base from foreign capitals. We have many brand names across the global market. Is it working? How do you like fresh air? I may up the air condition. So what? Recently, we have read the newspaper article about Louis Vuitton is often they claim the violation of intellectual property. The sales decreased recently, and they may enter into consignment sale agreement in long-term basis, 1 year, 2 years, in complicated. So a consignment sale would arise often, not in one-time transaction. Entails some duration in period for 1 year. And distribution agreement, often titled to denote the long-time relationship would be available, as I've said, in modality, standard form by Korean Commercial Code, Commercial Arbitration Board. So, what is the beginning reality that what sellers or buyers are faced with? You have a primal context about a pro forma invoice and a purchase order. The buyer would use the purchase order to express the intent of engagement in transaction. Then, in response, the pro forma invoice would be explored in terms of a price quotation and other many ways of variables that the seller need to consider. Other point against the domestic contract would involve this aspect, a price price quotation. So it involves a lengthy phase to finally be delivered to the warehouse or buyer. A shipment, many intermediaries would work to serve the commercial needs for freight forwarder, as I've said. In some case, inspection company should be hired to facilitate the transaction. So prudent traders often rely on some of formal disposition obtained by an inspection company. So inspection certificate would assuage his fear about a quality or quantity of goods. What else? And also the context is related with the WTO, public law institution, as you will learn. So the many agreements about a transaction of goods are now standing, 14
pieces, you see, and inspection company is one subject to require the member state to institute their domestic institution as complied with the requirement of treaty, you see. And also what? Marginal cost pricing, how to assess and finally determine the price in response to the purchase order launched by the seller. Cost plus method often entertained by a seller. So this concept also related to public law in terms of the Treaty on Tariff Concession. So the first priority point would be concerned about the ways to determine the price in purpose of a taxation, tariff and taxation. So that should be reasonable, and the domestic norms, what we often call in all-catching terms a domestic measure in WTO jargon, should comply with the method. So the concept is that unreasonable price assessment would risk harming the tariff concession. Often the member states made the agreement in self-context individually with arranged ways. You see WTO. So the tariff rate would become meaningless if arbitrary quotation of price would be permissible. So that is the concept. And a couple to ensure the compliance of a WTO tariff regime. That is a public law aspect, and also, but we now see some private nature dealings. You see a cost plus method and marginal cost price. So the seller would use cost plus method, and this way is that many new exporters calculate their export price. The exporter starts with the domestic manufacturing cost, and as administration, research and development, overhead, freight forwarding, distributor margins, custom charges, and profit. So the factors would base the final price quotation. The net effect of this pricing approach may be that the exporter price escalates into an uncompetitive range. So it is plenary to the seller's province, you see. And one other way is a marginal cost pricing. The method considers the direct out-of-pocket expenses of producing and selling products for export as a floor beneath which prices cannot be sold without incurring a loss. For example, products may have to be modified for the export market to accommodate a different sizes, electrical systems, or labeling requirements. Changes of this nature may increase cost. On the other hand, the export product may be stripped down version of domestic product and therefore cost less. If additional products can be produced without increasing fixed costs, the incremental cost of producing additional products export should be lower than the average production cost for the domestic market only. So the producer and seller would have several points to be complicated to address specifically between domestic and international markets. However, in some cases, they would be condemned in the very point of consideration that the dumping practices would not be permissible. So the margin goes down. And the seller, in this case, will consider the scope of additional costs, as in the above case, and market research, credit checks, and business travel, international postage, cable and telephone rates, translation costs, commissions, training charges, and other costs involving foreign representatives, consultant and freight forwarding costs, and product modification and special packaging. Another point of consideration would also play, for example, how that a foreign market is now in what circumstances. For example, this product would be new for the foreign market and may have more a power or a dominant market share would be probable, then the price could correspondingly may increase to exploit the foreign market. However, in other case, a more competitive context would arise to have more defensive policy and other scrupulous ways of approach required. Have you ever experienced a strawberry smoothie produced by angels in coffee? It is, I'm not sure, but it might be an international form, and the price is fairly high. I like a strawberry smoothie very much. So in routine cases, I order a couple of strawberry smoothie, which $6 in Korean currency. What is 50,700 won? It's comparable with one-time lunch. This implies that the market of that specific tasteful beverage could be monopolized by angels in coffee. So the price would well fall within the preliminary decision. And we often theoretically deal with the formation of contract in terms of offer and acceptance. You now need to have a practicalize about promo for invoice and purchase order. What is a promo for invoice? In Exhibit 9.2, you have been presented a sample of pro forma invoice, Tech International, and the date of dispatch,
January 12, 2005, the Commerce Cartagena. And the promo 4 invoice includes the description about the goods quantity, which covers quantity and unit extension. And on page 293, you have focus on transactions, international shipping checklist, commercial invoice, packing list, shipper's export declaration, bills of lading, a certificate of origin, and miscellaneous documents. So it depends on the scope of agreement that both parties specifically addressed in entering into the contract. However, bills of lading, there are some of essential documents, often not waived across almost all context of international transactions. To say a few, three, bills of lading and a bill of exchange and commercial invoice. A commercial invoice includes descriptions about exact content that both parties agree on. So it shows most extended form of a underlying contract and would be required for all cases to claim the contract money coupled with bills of lading. And also one other necessary document, it would be a draft or bill of exchange. There are types about draft, side draft, time draft, as I mentioned earlier, and also bills of exchange could be in scope, but often the definite sort would be used. So those three sets of documents would cover in essential aspect the documentation transaction, transaction. Additionally, there are other form of documents depending on the specific agreement by both parties. For example, in some countries, the national government would require a consular invoice in the purpose to identify and control the goods. And also, in some other jurisdiction, you may see some export and import requirement about inspection certificate. And particularly in the context of the United States, there are a distinct set of documents required as a matter of law, U.S. law. A shipper's export declaration is one of those. So in this case, we have to inquire. It just said required. Has the correct export license designation been used? Is an individual validated export license requirement? Have the commodity, consignee, and destination country been reviewed for export control? And also, certificate of origin would serve many purposes of government, particularly in terms of imposing a tariff tax. So how do you determine this product in terms of
national origin. Is it the product legally recognized as a U.S. made or China made? That is critically important to apply the trade regulation, national trade regulation. So most jurisdictions, all jurisdictions would have this type of regulation. So the rule about finding of origin should be harmonized and also comply with international standards. So this subject is also coming into play in one of multilateral trade agreement, WTO. So as I've said in early class, the jurisdiction of WTO had expanded very significantly from the previous form of GATT. That is not only the three pillars of subject matter, what we call trade of goods, trade of services, and intellectual property concern, but also the issues of trade of goods would be more treated in legal, detailed legal dealings. Okay? So the trade agreement about trade of goods had multiplied from the previous class. A certificate of origin is one of that context. We can penetrate through. So in promo for invoice, the description would often include buyer's name and address, buyer's reference number and date of inquiry, list of requested products, and brief description, price of each tin. In this case, it is advisable to indicate whether items are new or used and to quote in US dollars to reduce foreign exchange risk. And fifth, gross and net shipping weight. And in sixth, total cubic volume and dimension. And trade discount if applicable, delivery point, terms of sale, terms of payment, issuance and shipping costs, validity period for quotation, total charges to pay by customer, estimated shipping date from factory or U.S. port, and estimated date of shipment arrival. So the description would be extensive to define the contract in details, and also the pro forma invoice often would be based about a better of forms controversy. A purchase order, a pro forma invoice are critical instruments. We need to be careful about better of forms. So to alleviate the seller's risk of not being paid or the buyer's risk of not receiving the goods after making payment, most export contracts require documentary transaction. The sale of good contract is converted into sale of document contract, as I've said, and the buyer contract to buy documents, and the seller promised to provide conforming documents to the buyer while the goods are in transit. So this serves the commercial needs of a buyer. He should not have to wait a long period that he could actually receive the delivered goods. He may transfer the goods while the goods are in transit by means of a bill of trading. It represents the legal title, as I've said. So the commercial transaction will turn speedier. In the document transaction, The seller is paid and the buyer receives title to the goods while the goods are in transit to the port of destination. In this way, the buyer's delivery and seller's payment risks are diminished. Upon receiving the documents, the buyer is in a position to resell the goods to downstream buyers or to use documents as collateral to obtain financing. In the event that the buyer refuses to pay for documents, the seller still retains title and control of the goods. So both trends would stand in survival. So one other legal province would not merge other tenant. So as I've said, the seller will still have good cause of action about from the underlying country. Selling the goods to someone else through negotiation of document can then mitigate the losses. And we also consider the documentary collections transaction. The letter of credit law would be further explored in later classes. It is also a very important section. We have to have an awareness about the operation of rules and laws. And it is considered one way to finance the transaction on behalf of the seller, and some distinct rules should be explored later. Before that, we have a normal context of documentary collection transaction. So in this case, letter of credit is not used. A draft or bill of exchange is so cause of a claim through the intermediary and a paying bank. So you have some idea about the context. Drafts that are paid upon presentation or demand are called side drafts. Drafts that are payable at some time after presentation of documents are called time drafts. Bank use these instruments to effectuate a payment to the seller upon the presentation of documents. The draft is a written unconditional order for payment from the buyer to the drawer. In this case, the drawer would be a seller and the drawer would be buyer. And unlike the normal draft transaction or bills of exchange one, the drawer would simultaneously entitled to pay. Often that is the point of distinction against normal collection or normal draft transaction. It directs the drawer to pay a specified sum of money in a given currency on a specified date to the payer. The document transaction allows the buyer to take possession either by making payment upon the presentation of draft or by acceptance of draft. The first type of documentary collection transaction is called cash against document and is the ordinary means of processing a documentary collections transaction. The second type is referred to as documents against acceptance. So in focus on transaction, shown on page 298, lead you to a checklist for export-import transaction. So we first enter into sales contract, and the buyer may be obliged to obtain a letter of credit. So that depends on the terms and conditions of underlying contract. In some cases, the buyer may obtain confirmation of letter of credit. And other notable aspect would to hire carrier for transport of goods. Normally, ocean carriage and common carrier to engage in ocean carriage. And arranging inspection of goods prior to shipment would also one factor to check. Then the seller prepare goods for shipment and packing marking. In some cases, packing list constitutes a shipping document that is required to present to claim the contract money. The amount specified in the letter of credit when the letter of credit is agreed upon. In other case, the sum specified in the drafts or bill of lading, as I've said. And the seller now advanced to deliver to carrier. In the process, the seller may employ some more professional assistance. For example, freight forwarding service, and in this point, we have to consider the factor about issuance of bill of lading. What type of bill of lading is available, and also what legal significance could be present to types of a bill of lading, on-board bill of lading. And the buyer may present the shipping document to his local bank to claim the contract money, and it could be transmitted. The presented bank then transmits shipping documents to his peer institution. Often the local bank in business relationship with a buyer. So the kind of network is essential. And also in this advanced society, we may have some legal strength about e-transfer funds. Or you may practically encounter a peer transfer. It is also very notable international institution to facilitate the transfer funds by way of electronic means. And the international network of commercial banks also enable very speedy context of dealings about why the transfer of funds, why transfer of documents. So I have mentioned the EDI, electronic data interchange, would be preceded by these public institutions. Often the public institutions would come ahead of private dealings and more articulated in many aspects to encounter. Of course, that is not always true, since the private initiative would be evolved in more sensitive areas. However, the public institution or concept of public administration often be anchored more firmly to deal with. So in deliberation of these issues, we also need to have a comparative analysis between public and private. WTO, as I've said, is notable institution, along with many FTAs and other trade regulations, national, international trade regulations. And I have remarked on several illustrations about that interplay. So both dimensions would be structured very fundamentally with a democratic form of governance in contemporary times. Once I read the philosophical pioneering work from Bentham, for example, here's Rywit is very echoing in terms of free riding contention about intellectual property or rights. So what is universal interest? What is a private and personal interest? Since Bentham are required to elaborate on public utility or administration concept, he emphasized the primacy of universal interest against private or personal interest. He produced actually many works about many of scope of a social, political scope of issues, which in the contemporary framework be viewed as political sociology or political moralities. So his main tone and argument would, from the private personal interest. So his main prong to promote would lie in a universal interest, a greater number of happiness of people, how do you see? And interestingly, he may withdraw from his strong argument in the preserve of a civil code. So his work is titled, in terms of civil code framework, but I cannot tell the exact name, I'm sorry. In any case, the public law idea may not penetrate all the ways of our existence. So he has faced the dilemma about a civil arrangement, particularly. So that is very stuck in sensibilities against his main tone about public administration. It is interesting to illustrate a housebreaker or highwayman. Both cases are notably culpable, and in Bentham's idea, the public utility should have been evangelized to benefit all the scope of citizens, and they share the universal interest in pursuit of the private and personal interest. So public version will dominate the private personal interest. In his least sense, it should comply with. He also presented four squares of a public utility concept, element, for example, efficient? Is it included in it? Very useful to see. But are we compelled in our legitimate sense of justice to protect the kind of worst people, highwaymen, housebreaker? So in Bandam, he saw those persons, free rider. That is the extreme case in comparison. But now comes into a comparable context about intellectual property controversy between developed and developing countries. But I don't see it as same as the kind of Bandam's idea. How do you perceive? So you may have some complement sources in studying international trade law, I suggest. And the seller in 11th stage obtained a payment on the letter of credit. And in 12th, entering customs clearance in the country of delivery would be completed. And finally, liquidation of customs duties and delivery to import may be realized. So, you see, the 10th point is common requirement of standard sales contract. And also, you see, to diminish the risk of fraudulent documentation, a prudent buyer negotiates for inspection rights. So, you have a typical process in each step to check your export and import transaction. However, that would vary depending on specific circumstances, and also a matter of negotiation to maximize both commercial interests. So, as I've said, the party autonomy and freedom of contract are two prongs as a governing theme about a private contract. However, so that also a point we need to juxtapose against Bandam's case and sphere. However, we see some foible from Rousseau, and I encountered once a very interesting article about that point. So, private context of distinct contractual relationship would be explained more facile from the tenet of Rousseau. Both share same viewpoints about liaison of a civil interest, private, a personal interest, which is sad. So in the contract area, private and personal interest are governing theme, as I've said. And Bandam's argument would highly prefer to articulate some of guidelines about the public administration. And in that point, we have some eclectic viewpoint in the concept of liaison or networked, or bridged between private and public. So that scheme actually be assessed to be realized in WTO. So the WTO regime would be an governing instrumentality to bridge liaison the private personal and a universal interest in terms of commerce, international commerce. The international sales contract almost always provides for transit of goods by ocean carriers. Under standard CIF contract, what does this term mean? It cost insurance freight. So the allocation of risks and also the issue who bears the cost of transportation or insurance would come, as I will see later in trade terms, by International Chamber of Commerce. And in CIF terms, transaction, cost, insurance, and freight should be borne by the seller. And as you see later, that is most dominant fashion that the parties engaged in the international contract and comply with the normal sense of a private justice. So, the opposite case would be a destination terms. How do you see terms? CIF, FOB, most popular terms for the parties would not be a destination terms. The seller must ship the goods by obtaining the services of freight forwarding company and a common carrier to transfer the goods to the buyer. The contract will require the seller to obtain a bill of lading from the common carrier to prove that the goods have been sent as dictated by the contract. The seller will not be able to receive payment unless it delivers to the bank for transmission to the buyer a conforming bill of lading along with the other documents stated in the sales contract. After the bank reviews the documents, the seller receives payment, and upon receipt of the bill of lading and other documents, the buyer is then able to take delivery of the goods for import into country. So I've reiterated the process of international transaction, export-import transactions. That is important in the practical context, which also leads to legal consequence as encoded in trade terms, what we call Incoterms by ICC. What is Incoterms? It is the abbreviation of international commercial terms. And the terms reflects the uses, trade uses, long evolved among the merchant society. So I've said one of a representative example is Incoterms in view of a new lex mercatoria, law merchant. So most traders would have no difficulty if they pick up some of trade terms which are considered to facilitate the commercial needs. And one practical tip to be useful for the party would be that they would get better not to vary the terms in any contrary or ambiguous special agreement. Of course, their agreement could work if set up in express and clear language, However, in many cases, they fail to stipulate any concrete meanings about the practical language or incorporated into contract. So let it as is would be better policy, better wisdom to prevent from controversies or disputes. And many cases later reviewed briefly would involve the context of conflict of terms between the trade terms employed and a specific agreement contained in the contract. So what is a genuine intent of contractual party would be serious contended. So the point of scrutiny, the court would often involve. You see in Exhibit 9.3, document collections a flowchart. Export. So you have a buyer's bank and seller and buyer. And seller send the document collection letter to buyer's bank, and the buyer's bank intermediate the transaction by notification of documents, acceptance of documents, drafts, release of documents. If documents finally released, the buyer may take those shipping documents to the carrier to claim the goods, and often employ customs house broker to complete a custom clearance, taxation issues or others, and buyer and a seller are the parties on the sales contract. The typical document collections transaction proceeds along a chronological timeline. It begins with the negotiation and execution of sales contract. The sales contract is usually formed by the exchange of pro forma invoice or price quotation from the seller and a purchase order from the buyer. The seller often contracts a freight forwarder to obtain freight costs and insurance information before drafting the pro forma invoice. After the contract is formed, the seller contacts the freight forwarder to book shipment on a common carrier. The freight forwarder coordinates the movement of the goods. He submits the export documentation to U.S. Customs and Border Protection, obtains the bill of lading from the carrier, and compiles other required documents. So the bill of lading is a title document, as I've said, that allows the goods to be transferred while they are in transit to the port of destination. This is a central importance of shipping documents to represent title of goods. Without this, the document transaction would not be possible. The bill of lading allows the sale of goods transaction to be converted to sale of documents. Upon receiving the bill of lading, the buyer becomes the owner of the goods. Any dispute of the ownership of goods will be resolved in favor of party in possession of the bill of lading, and not the party in the actual possession of the goods. We have distinct rules about a bill of lading in accordance with national and international context. To obtain the bill of lading, the goods are delivered to the common carrier. The bill of lading is endorsed by the shipper and sent by the shipper's bank to the buyer's bank or to another intermediary, along with the side draft, invoices, and other supporting documents specified by the buyer, such as packing list, consular invoice, and insurance certificate. The seller usually does not submit the documents and draft directly to the buyer's bank, along with the documentary collections. These documents are presented to the buyer's bank along with a documentary collections letter or order. The collection letter or order includes a draft drawn on the buyer's account, either payable at site or at a future time. So you may have next class in another classroom, then mark your attendance and may leave. So on page 29A through 3000, you have various form of documentation. As I've said, it depends on the agreement of parties. What documents are required and should be included to claim the contract money. And in Exhibit 9.4, you a commercial invoice, and in the form there are many detailed information about a shipper and date, the number of bill of lading or air bill, invoice number, purchase order, terms of sale, reason for export, and the information about the buyer, a city, a state, province, postal code, country, telephone number, and email identification. Particular importance and description should be found in number of units, unit of measure, description of goods, country of origin, unit value, total value. So in later classes, we will review the letter of credit principle or rules, and one rule requires the exact compliance of documents to the contractual requirement. And there are distinct rules which depends on the quality of document. A commercial invoice, the document that the party by himself had prepared. In that type of document, notably invoice, commercial invoice, the code required more strict compliance in comparative examination on contractual terms and the content of document. So only conforming documents would entitle the buyer to the right of contract money. So the documents presented should be same. The extent of vary, however, as I've said,
whether it is a document of self-preparation or document produced by third parties. A bill of lading is document disposed by a shipper, you see, and its issuance would have done some of legal significance, legal event. For example, it was delivered to the shipper's hand, or the onboard document may further evidence that the goods are placed in the place of a ship also. So the difference may be identified in other type of bill of lading. So the document presented would in scope, depending on the agreement. And all the documents should comply with contractual requirement. So it is the right and duty of a presented bank about the payment of letter of credit sum. And he should exercise due care and careful scrutiny according to the standard of law. What standard of examination should apply? Doesn't matter. And commercial invoice is self-prepared document, so requires more exact compliance against other third-party document. So you see the list of export documents on page 300, and often the international transaction involves letter of credit. So it was listed in this tip, and also many sort of documents. Consular invoice, a certificate of inspection, and as I've said, the international transaction may be undertaken in trade regulations about export license. In this case, export license would be indispensable to construct the contractual relationship. So government issued document granting permission to export a specific commodity to a specific country. What is letter of credit? A document issued by the importer, purchaser's bank, to guarantee the payment of draft to the exporter for the purchase of the goods or upon presentation of documents by the exporter. The transferable letter of credit allows the exporter to make the credit payable to others. And incidentally, a letter of indemnity may be required to present. This document allows the carrier to release goods to the consignee not yet in possession of the bill of lading. It is guaranteed to indemnify the carrier from all liability related to the release. It is also called a steamer guarantee. One other interesting document would be ISO.9 certificate. It is a document to prove international quality standards to certify the exporter meets certain minimum requirements of quality. And maritime insurance certificate or binder would be included in some cases. And you have a summary of introduction about the bill of lading. This is one of the important subjects discussed in commercial law. So I refer you to the further details about the context of commercial law in other classes. The Bill of Lading is a traditional transport document and serves three functions: carriage contract between the ship owner and the shipper, evidence of receipt that the goods were delivered to the ship, and document of title. Its function as a title document allows for the sale, transfer, and a collateralization of the goods while in transit. So you have a point shared by a Lord Mustill, which diverges its important quality. In discussing the third function of the Bill of Lading, it states, it is a symbol of constructive possession of the goods, which can transfer possession by endorsement and transfer. It is a transferable key to the warehouse. And also, you have some useful case titled the MJ Trading Corporation versus a Carver Ltd. In this case, the shipper agreed that a prior freight agreement governed. The shipper argued that a prior freight agreement governed, while the common carrier contended that its bill of lading constituted the contract. The court reasoned that the resolution of such disputes turns on factual and legal issues relating to, for example, the parties' negotiations, the documents generated during those negotiations, and the status and legal effect of the bill of lading. By the express terms of the prior agreement, the carrier's general obligation began upon the initial pickup of the goods in Canada and continued until final delivery in Russia. The court held that the bill of lading could have only at most supplemented the parties' prior agreement, unless the parties clearly agreed otherwise. Therefore, the bill of lading did not nullify the lengthy course of negotiations that culminated in the prior freight agreement. So the court rules on some of practical possibilities that reshape the bills of lading terms. I suppose it could not be possible if contradicted in express terms. However, it is a matter of construction where ambiguities arise, I consider. And other point about a recent transformation in the mode of transaction would be covered on 2 pages, from 301 to 303. What is electronic data interchange in terms of legal consequence? EDI had its genesis in the mid-1980s with the development of rules of electronic bills of lading by Comte Maritime International. Under these rules, the right to control goods and transfer possession was based on the possession of private key made available by the carrier upon the shipper's receipt of goods. The private key could be construed in any technically appropriate form the parties could agree upon for securing the authenticity and integrity of the electronic transmission. And the United Nations Commission on International Trade Law, UNCITRAL in abbreviation, started to develop the 1996 model law for electronic commerce. The model law recognized the primary functions of bill of lading are to evidence an agreement, give a party the legal right to claim goods from a carrier, and transferize the goods in transit. The model rules conclude that these functions can be provided in a medium other than a paper document, specifically an electronic exchange of message or electronic bill of lading. I've said a bolero earlier. The most recent effort in EDI is the development of system named Bolero. Created in April 1998 by the Society for Worldwide Interbank Financial Telecommunication and through Transport Club. So the system is designed to be utilized by all parties in the trade process, including importers, exporters, freight forwarders, port authorities, inspection agencies, carriers, customs agencies, and financial institutions. So Bolero is based on core messaging platform that enables users to exchange electronic trade documents through the internet. Another example of electronic international commerce is Paction, a web-based application that permits parties to prepare, negotiate, and complete contracts for the international purchase and sale of goods online. The contracts resulting from the process are based on the model international sales contract developed by the International Chamber of Commerce. So now we talk about a creative economy. What is creative economy? So, have you attended the previous lecture, Minhwa Lee? I'm not sure his exact name, Minhwa Kim, Minhwa Lee, who is a very successful Korean businessman in 1990s. He is one of cult in venture capital. He carried very successfully the business, very of updated nature, and based on technological innovation. He later left for some of difficult commercial challenges and also subject to the court proceeding in criminal context. He returned to deliver a special lecture. In his discourse, we can face with many useful points about the creative economy. Now, the current Park's administration stressed very important in a powerful manner. And, it is actually true that now the global economy turns to be stagnant. And only way to penetrate this challenge would be on a creative economy and a web-based application, for example, of Paction, and also restructuring is very interesting. For example, in his illustration, Apple is now one of major global corporations. Its share in the global capital market was ranked one of top classes. What is that? Here, the company had some of a production facility in China. Most of their work would be highly technological and also in its exact implications may be superstructure to lead the base structure of industries. So some of small cores in high technology and critical network would enable to produce much values commercially. So the point we need to follow about transformation of a global capitalist economy. And what are characteristics of bill of lading? So we have two types, on-board bill of lading and received for shipment bill of lading. The latter type recognizes only the delivery of the goods to the common carrier. It does not warrant that the goods have been placed upon the ship. And more popular form of bill of lading and officialized into the type endorsed by UCP, Uniform Commercial Practice. And you have two words which may be easily confused, UCC, UCP. You have idea to distinguish. UCC means Uniform Commercial Code, and UCP is the norm, or soft law, acted by International Chamber of Commerce on the letter of credit transaction. UCC have leeways about the types of bill of lading. UCC is not definite about the acceptability in a formal arrangement. It depends on the parties engaged in the contract. However, UCP may get definite about onboard a bill of lading. So absent a contrary agreement by the parties, a received for shipment bill of lading would not legitimate the claims for the contract money. It is not conforming shipping document. So the bank, commercial bank, may lawfully reject the presentation of a receipt for a shipment bill of lading. And another concept about types would be a straight bill of lading, and order bill of lading, and clean bill of lading. Another important, popular shipping document about transport of goods would be an airway bill. In the event of transport by air, the operative transport document is the airway bill. And you have the forms in graphical form in the Exhibit 9.6. This document is different in its legal characteristics against a bill of lading. It does not bear the legal title of goods. It is a non-negotiable instrument that serves as a receipt for the shipper. Unlike the ocean bill of lading, the airway bill does not act as a document of title. Therefore, it merely serves as a contract of carriage and a receipt for goods. The front of the airway bill makes a number of important representations. So you have points to be described in summary. So consider those points of this class. So any questions? We start here. The class coverage was not progressed in order, so we may move forward and may return to have some more points of discussion about a previous topic. So you may keep that point in attending this class. Thank you for your attention and see you